I look like my grandma. Oh my god, that is delicious. Oh, I look like I married a man just to open a bank account. I look like I belong on like a vacuum cleaner advertisement. Hello, how are you? My name is Kylie. If this is your first time here, welcome to my channel. Glad to have ya. Today we're going to be talking about horror movies from the 1950s, and this is kicking off my Horror Through the Decades series on this channel. I wanted to do something special and cool for this spooky season, so I settled on decades of horror. So I'm going to be doing a top 10 horror movies from every decade, starting with today with the 1950s. But I'm actually going to be ranking literally every 1950s horror movie I've seen, but I think there's only 17 of them. So we will get to the top 10 and I won't go in depth until we get to the top 10. But also, before we even get into the ranking, I want to talk about some things that I've learned upon this journey, if you will. I've been watching a ton of 1950s horror movies and I feel like I've learned a lot about the decade. So I just want to share some of those things with you. Number one, the way that people kissed was revolting. I wish that I knew what possessed actors to kiss in the way that they did in the 1950s, but it's disgusting. They fully like smush into each other, and often the woman is a bit shorter than the man, and so she's all like, and then the man is all, and they're just, it's so disgusting. And they just kind of move their mouths around like, and they don't really actually kiss at all. And also, I don't believe that this is just limited to horror. I think just in movies in general at the time, the way that people kissed was nasty. I very much doubt that we have anybody that was doing any kissing in the 1950s watching this video. But if you're here or like you grew up in the 50s watching your parents kiss, please tell me, was that accurate to how people actually kissed? Because if so, then I just have way more questions. Nonetheless, we need to move on. The second thing that I have learned is that character relationships were very, very weird, namely because it was very evident that a lot of male screenwriters had never actually interacted with a real woman before. A lot of the romances in the stories are very unnecessary or very forced. Oftentimes back then, also, I feel like actors just didn't really have that kind of chemistry with one another. So you get a lot of very strange relationships in movies in the 50s. The third thing that I have learned, the plot with a lot of 1950s movies tends to meander quite a lot. I would say once we start getting into the top 10 though, maybe like top 5 for sure, the plots cease to meander and they really do stand alone as like really good narrative works. A lot of the other movies kind of rely on their groundbreaking special effects or like the moments in which the monsters were on screen, or sometimes there's a standout acting performance or something like that. But once we get into the top 5, we actually have really well-crafted narratives. But just in general back then, they still had a long ways to go. They still needed to learn a lot about movie making before they had kind of mastered the craft. So the writing is not always great. There's a lot of meandering, there's a lot of dialogue. A lot of these movies are very dialogue heavy. The fourth thing that I've learned? Number 4. People were really scared of aliens and monsters. This was really when pop culture started to be centered around the unknown and around science. This is when I think science was having a big flourishing kind of a moment. So in several of these movies, they actually touch on the concept of evolution. And it also, of course, touches on the fear of the unknown, because typically just in our civilization, for some reason, whenever we don't know about something, but there's like a new scientific discovery, people are very scared of it. And I think this was a time when people were really starting to realize the limits of their own knowledge. Like the limits of their knowledge on both space, of the sea, all the different creatures on Earth alone were just terrifying to people. So they made a lot of monster and alien movies in the 50s. That is why it is one of my favorite decades of horror. But they had to do it right. There were a lot of movies that were just very underwhelming because you could tell that a lot of them were trying to copy the more successful movies at the time, but they simply just didn't have the budget nor maybe the imagination to pull it off. So a lot of the movies I'm going to talk about, I really don't recommend. That is, of course, until we get to my top 10, don't worry. The next thing that I learned, this is a great decade to start with if you are a beginner for horror. If you really, really want to get into horror movies, but you scare really easily, don't worry. I used to as well. Despite even growing up on all of these 50s movies and on horror and alien movies in general, it still took me several years to get desensitized and kind of get used to a lot of the horror elements and not get scared, and even in some cases not get nightmares anymore. So if you like horror, but you're kind of a baby and like maybe you can't watch it by yourself, I think I can guarantee that these are all movies you would be able to watch by yourself. Because even though I do think that a lot of these hold up by today's standards, I mean, you can still tell that they're dated. Maybe that doesn't make sense. Like, you can tell that they're dated, but they do hold up really well, so I don't know, you figure that one out. Bottom line, it's excellent horror for beginners. The last thing that I learned about this decade of horror is that the posters are bonkers. They're ridiculous. I love them. I think the poster art for some of these movies is just mwah. It is top tier. However, with a lot of the movies that have these amazing posters, for example, The Wasp Woman and Attack of the 50-Foot Woman, love these posters. These are iconic, sensational. However, very unfortunately, the movies, both of these movies, heavily under-deliver on their promises of what these amazing posters promised. So that is a common theme throughout the 50s. But that does it for kind of all of the general stuff that I just observed while watching all of these 1950s movies. So now it is time to get into my ranking. Like I said, I do have 17, but for these first couple of movies, I'm not going to read off the synopsis. I'm just going to let you know where I ranked them, because we'll get into all the good stuff once I get to the top 10. Coming in at number 17, dead last, that would go to The Wasp Woman, mainly for the reason that I just pointed out, although I have to admit, thematically, I do think it's actually kind of amazing. The execution of basically everything is terrible, but it has a very strong female lead. She was an independent and self-made businesswoman in the 1950s. So the story kind of follows this character that's trying to break free of some of the gender norms of society, but she's still trying to cling desperately to the kind of beauty and glamour that was expected of women at the time. This will be a common theme, and hopefully I don't repeat myself too much, but this was a very progressive film for that time. Horror is that Horror has always been one of the most progressive genres, and that's why I love so many of the movies on this list. So that'll be another common theme, actually. That's something else that I should have pointed out that I learned while watching all these movies from the 50s. Horror is a very progressive genre. Kind of already touched on this, but the last reason why this fell dead last is because on the poster, she looks like a badass monster, and then in the movie, this is what we get. Like, girl, what is this? Anyways, moving on to number 16, that would be Forbidden Planet. This one is from 1956. The reason why this one fell dead last is, again, because of something that I mentioned. There are some very, very weird character relationship dynamics in this movie. These spacemen go to this planet where this doctor and his daughter lives, and every single member of the crew of that ship tries to have sex with this doctor's daughter. And it's super, super weird, and for a lot of the film, they're kind of just like taking advantage of her naivety, and they're all kissing her like for science. It's very, very weird, and I'm really just not sure what the point of the movie was. But I kind of have to give it credit because I do think that the set design is actually really cool, and some of the costumes are pretty gorgeous, but that's all that this movie gets credit for from me. Up next at number 15 would be The Mummy from 1959, mainly because I couldn't really get over the pacing issues of this movie. There wasn't really enough payoff for me to overlook those issues, because I do think that by today's standards, a lot of movies from back then just seem a lot slower, and like I said, they do like to meander a lot. Normally I can overlook that. With The Mummy, I couldn't, because I felt like the story was kind of just really all over the place. There was a lot of really annoying narration and stuff, and also one of the main reasons is because they had all of these white people that were painted brown, and they were supposed to be portraying Egyptians. That was very weird, but not uncommon for the time, unfortunately. So yeah, not my fave, kind of an uncomfy viewing experience. Coming in at number 14 would be Attack of the 50-Foot Woman. I talked about this movie in my last video in my August wrap-up, so you kind of already know the reasons why I don't like it, and I already also mentioned that the poster looked insane and then the movie just really under-delivered. Not much more to say. Up next would be The Blob from 1958, coming in at number 13. This one has its moments. The moments with The Blob are pretty good, but they are so few and far between that it's just not really worth the watch of the whole movie. But that one is apparently a beloved sci-fi classic, so I don't know, do with that what you will. Coming in at number 12 would be Return of the Fly, also from 1959. This is just the sequel to the original The Fly from, I think, 1958. It's just a much lesser sequel. Maybe you would have more fun with it because you do get more fly in it, but in my personal opinion, there's just a lot less suspense. There really is no more mystery at that point, so I just much prefer the first original movie. Coming in at number 11, this one is definitely an honorable mention because I did enjoy this this movie. This came out in 1959, and I think that this movie is gorgeous. I think that it is really well shot. Definitely kind of has a noir kind of dramatic vibe, and also the practical effects hold up decently well. So that one, even though it didn't make the cut, it is one that I still recommend that you watch. Also stars Vincent Price. Oh my god, I'm so bad. Oh my god, I put it in my notes. I'm so dumb. The last thing that I learned about the 1950s, I'm just gonna have to insert this here. I just remembered because he just came up, and Vincent Price kind of ran the horror genre back in the 1950s. I think that also kind of continued into the 60s as well, but in the 1950s, he was that boy. He was the spookiest boy in school. He was Universal's favorite to cast in horror movies and monster movies. He is one of my favorite horror actors of all time, and definitely my favorite actor from the 50s. Okay, my bad. Now it is time to get on to my top 10. So coming in at number 10 would be Dracula, although I believe this movie is also known as Horror of Dracula. This came out in 1958. On a search for his missing friend Jonathan Harker, vampire hunter Dr. Van Helsing is led to Count Dracula's castle. With the help of her brother, Van Helsing struggles to protect Lucy and put an end to Count Dracula's parasitic reign of terror. Little pointer, this movie is currently on HBO Max, as is The Mummy, and I think, what else did I watch? I think I watched The Blob on HBO Max too. So anyways, this movie made number 10 because it's not one of my favorites. I didn't enjoy the entire duration of the movie, but a lot of the practical effects are just a real mixed bag of fun. I was watching this movie by myself and was like audibly laughing at some of the practical effects that they used, and also some of the acting. I know that that was kind of the style for the time, so I can't even really qualify it as like bad acting, but it's just so over the top and it's so cheesy, and I live for that. So Dracula is definitely one that you want to watch if you want to have some fun. It's not a super serious horror movie. It's also shot in color, which I thought that it was originally in black and white, but apparently not. I don't love that because I don't feel like it sets the mood for Dracula very well. It's actually very fun and very colorful, which kind of adds to like the comedic tone of the movie, although I don't think it's supposed to have a comedic tone. Oh well. So I just really love the performances of this one. I do think a lot of the practical effects actually do hold up. Not all of them are hilarious, but some of them definitely are. But it is a lot of fun. I think if you're a dedicated horror fan, this is something that you should watch at some point in your life. Up next, coming in at number 9 would be Them from 1954. While investigating a series of mysterious deaths, Sergeant Ben finds a young girl who is unable to speak. As Peterson joins forces with FBI agent Robert Graham and scientist Dr. Harold Medford, he discovers that all the incidents are due to giant ants that have been mutated by atomic radiation. This movie really could have made it higher up on my list if, again, it didn't meander so much with the plot. There are a lot of very strong moments in the movie, and there are stretches of about 20 to 30 minutes at a time where I think that the movie is very gripping and like it's very consistent. However, then we still end up like going back and forth, and there are just a lot of inconsistencies. Like for instance, there is a doctor, and again, he has a daughter, and she's presented as a very strong lead. She is someone that really wants to be involved, and then she's not really super involved with the story beyond that point. I mean, she's still there, but she's just not really doing much. It's kind of odd. It's just a character inconsistency because she seems like she's this really strong, hard-headed person, and then she doesn't end up being that way for like the rest of the movie. So at first when I was watching the movie, I was like, hell yeah, that's girl boss energy right there. And then she totally fell flat, so bummer. But that aside, I also really enjoy the character of her father, this doctor who is kind of the expert on the ants. He has an incredible performance. I think whenever he's on screen, I'm having a lot of fun because I'm also learning a lot. They do bring in a lot of the actual science that was known at the time about ants, and they actually use that for very well structured plot points, which I really enjoy. So this one especially, I think if you want to see some old practical effects, this one is super worth seeing. I think the way that they did the ants, I mean, albeit it's kind of funny, but it does hold up pretty well. And there is a really good mix of the kind of scientific dialogue and then also the action of them actually dealing with the ants. And then coming in at number 8, this one actually follows a similar theme of insects, because coming in at number 8 would be The Fly from 1958. When scientist Andre Delambre tests his matter transporter on himself, an errant housefly makes its way into the transportation chamber and things go horribly wrong. This is the first movie I think of several on this list that star Vincent Price. He plays the inspector in this movie. He is the one trying to get to the bottom of the disappearance of this doctor. I did mention this in my August wrap-up as well, but this follows the classic structure of a whodunit mystery movie. I say that it loosely kind of follows the formula because it is a very unique take on it, and it's also a non-linear story, so they do kind of set up the mystery initially and then they go back in time, which is something that I enjoy if it's done well. Also, the practical effects of this movie are very, very strange. Not so much the fly itself, but the ending of the movie has this very disturbing sequence. If you want to avoid spoilers, skip ahead. I just really want to talk about the ending of this movie because it is so bizarre. Essentially, with this whole movie, they're trying to capture a fly with a white head because it is the one that has swapped heads with the doctor. And then finally, at the end, when they discover where the fly is, he is actually trapped in a spider's web. And we get this really gruesome close-up experience just watching this poor man fly getting eaten by a spider. And I don't know if it's because the effects are outdated, those 50s effects, they're just so unnerving. Like, it's just so weird. I feel very uniquely disturbed by the ending of The Fly. I've truly never really seen anything like that before, and that's why it made its way onto my top 10 list. Okay, we're gonna move on now to number 7, which goes to The Day the Earth Stood Still from 1951. When a UFO lands in Washington, D.C., bearing a message for Earth's leaders, all of humanity stands still. Klaatu has come on behalf of alien life who have been watching Cold War-era nuclear proliferation on Earth. But it is Klaatu's soft-spoken robot Gort that presents a more immediate threat to onlookers. A single mother and her son teach the world about peace and tolerance in this moral fable, ousting the tanks and soldiers that greet the aliens' arrival. So again, we have another incredibly progressive film. I feel like the 50s was really when Hollywood was harnessing their power and their ability to kind of sway public perception. Because even at this time after the war, when you had like the popularity of Rosie the Riveter and everybody in society being engaged in World War II in some way, after that, at least in entertainment in the Hollywood sphere, they were really trying to get people to start questioning that. And they were trying to get people to like question their obedience to the military and things like that with movies like this. As stated in the synopsis, it is a moral fable about, you know, peace. And I think that even though not much really happens in the movie, there's not a whole lot of action. I don't mind that because I think that the richest part of this movie is all of the dialogue. It is about the alien just interacting with humans and everything that he learns from humans, you know, the good and the bad. I think that it is insanely interesting. And this is also a movie that I feel like holds up to today because a lot of the things that he learns about humanity I think are still applicable. It's just really cool to kind of learn about your own society through the eyes of an alien, you know, somebody that is not familiar with it at all. Just an outside observer, you know? And again, this is a movie that definitely reflects the fears of people at the time. Of course, at this time, people didn't really want to touch war with a 10-foot pole. Of course, at this time, people would be more receptive to watching movies that were along the themes of tolerance and inclusion. So that one, I know it's not really a horror movie, it's definitely more sci-fi, and it's even kind of like borderline sci-fi because not too much happens in the movie. It is mostly just about the character relationships and learning about humanity. So maybe that one is for my fellow scholars out there. Not so much for my horror fans, but I think that this next one, I think that it will be for the horror people. Coming in at number 6 would be The War of the Worlds from 1953. Scientist Clayton Forrester and Sylvia Van Buren are the first to arrive at the site of a meteorite crash. Soon after, an alien war machine emerges and begins killing at random. The Marines are called in, but they're no match for the alien's force field. Forrester and Van Buren, however, are able to wound one of the creatures and produce a sample of its blood. They take it to Los Angeles, where they hope through testing to be able to discover the alien's weakness. So this is one that's kind of the exact opposite of The Day That the Earth Stood Still, because this one is action-packed. Dare I say, I don't think that there are any dull moments in this movie. I mean, maybe in the beginning when the action is just starting to ramp up, but this is absolutely a war movie, which is kind of baffling to me because I would figure at the time that's probably not the kind of movie that people would want to see. Although at the time, people obviously did fear the unknown, they feared aliens, and so this would have been a very effective horror movie for the time. This is also kind of the exact opposite to The Day the Earth Stood Still for a number of reasons, namely because it is also kind of a pro-military movie, but it's a lot of fun. Honestly, this one might have made it lower than The Day the Earth Stood Still, but there is just so much action, and honestly, the practical effects, I believe, still hold up to today. I mean, the filming style is dated, so obviously you can tell that it's dated, but the effects themselves, I think, do hold up. The reason why it only got so high as number 6, though, is because there are a lot of religious references that are kind of shoehorned in, and frankly, to me, just a little bit annoying. This movie is very pro-military and pro-organized religion, which just, I don't know, I don't like that. But everything else about the movie, I think, is great. I think my only other gripe with it is that the chemistry between the leads, again, there's like a really weird forced romance there. That doesn't work for me super well. I think I gave it 3.5 stars out of 5, because it's really just one that's good to watch if you enjoy the practical practical effects, if you like the action, it's a fun movie. And it's also not slow at all. It's definitely ahead of its time when it comes to the pacing because there is a lot of action in the movie. Okay, coming to my top 5 movies, these are all movies that I believe I rate at least 4 stars or higher. And honestly, a couple of these movies are damn near perfect to me. But starting with my number 5, and that would go to the incredible Creature from the Black Lagoon from 1954. Remnants of a mysterious animal have come to light in a remote jungle, and a group of scientists intends to determine if the find is an anomaly or evidence of an undiscovered beast. To accomplish their goal, the scientists must brave the most perilous pieces of land South America has to offer, but the terrain is nothing compared to the danger posed by an otherworldly being that endangers their work and their lives. This movie is gorgeous. This movie is light years ahead of its time. This movie made groundbreaking moves in the way of underwater cinematography, as well as with the costuming. I mean, the creature himself looks phenomenal. This movie is just special and unique in so many ways. I feel like even by today's standards, that underwater cinematography is just mwah. You don't really see a lot of that these days. I mean, we don't have a lot of monster movies in general, but definitely not ones that take place underwater. What's even more impressive is how much character energy these actors were able to radiate amidst all of their like diving equipment and the monster himself who could barely even see through his suit. It's phenomenal, and it also touches upon themes of evolution. It touches on the themes of white people showing up in somebody else's home, wreaking havoc, doing whatever they want, and ultimately destroying, but they're all doing it in the name of science and discovery. It's a movie that again is so ahead of its time. It's very clear to me where Guillermo del Toro got all the inspiration for The Shape of Water. That movie is 100% a love letter to Creature from the Black Lagoon in several different ways. Namely, I feel like Del Toro looked at this film and he said, yes, it's good, but it's not horny enough. And so he expanded on that part of the story, which is good for some people. I think a lot of the acting is phenomenal, the set design is exquisite. It's just one of those classics that I think every horror fan, regardless if you enjoy this decade or not, this is one that you have to see. Okay, moving on to my number 4, that would go to The Thing from Another World. This came out in 1951. When scientist Dr. Carrington reports a UFO near his North Pole research base, the Air Force sends in a team under Captain Patrick Hendry to investigate. What they find is a wrecked spaceship and a humanoid creature frozen in the ice. They bring their discovery back to the base, but Carrington and Hendry disagree over what to do with it. Meanwhile, the creature is accidentally thawed and begins wreaking havoc. Again, we have another movie that is very based on evolution and science. In this movie, we also have this group of men that is again heavily questioning the military and questioning their orders. If you can't tell, I really enjoy all of those themes. With this one, again, this is yet another movie that inspired another filmmaker, obviously John Carpenter, who made the legendary remake of The Thing in 1982. And you can so clearly see all of the little pieces that he took out to craft this brilliant remake. But I love this original movie almost just as much. Again, it's really similar to The Day the Earth Stood Still because I think of all the dialogue and the way that these characters kind of explore the unknown. The way that science is tied in, the way that they discuss evolution because this monster that crashed there, or sorry, I should say alien, he essentially evolved from vegetables. Whereas humans, we evolved from fish or whatever, they came up onto land and whatever. But this being, he evolved from plants. So it's just really cool to see them back in the day exploring the concepts of evolution. I think the things that John Carpenter pulled from this movie that he expanded upon really well are as follows. In the original, there are very brief moments of a dog that is involved in the plot. John Carpenter obviously took this and he used the dogs to provide a great deal more horror elements, to provide a great deal more mystery in the movie. So he took the dog from the original and then he used it as kind of a plot device for the buildup of the horror. The original movie is also very dialogue heavy, as a lot of these movies are. John Carpenter kind of took the tension between the leads, especially with the scientist, and he expanded upon that. And in John Carpenter's The Thing, he is so accurately able to capture paranoia and present it through his character relationships. And then, of course, you know, the practical effects. Of course, John Carpenter did it the best. But this original movie movie, I did give it 4.5 stars, I think, out of 5, because I love it. I think maybe equally to John Carpenter's The Thing. Okay, making our way to my top 3, coming in at number 3 would be House on Haunted Hill from 1959. Rich oddball Frederick Loren, played by Vincent Price by the way, has a proposal for 5 guests at a possibly haunted mansion. Show up, survive a night filled with scares, and receive $10,000 each. So this movie, this is another one where unfortunately the practical effects don't really hold up, but the story does. The story and all the acting and I think the set design are all exquisite. There is an amazing twist in the end. I think narratively it is so strong, which is why I believe it holds up so well and why it maintains my attention a lot better than some of these other movies. I believe it also comes in at just over an hour long. It's a very short movie. It's very effective with its pacing, which that's kind of a complaint I have about a lot of movies today, is they're so long. I wish that people would realize that it's okay to make a short movie sometimes, but this is definitely one of Vincent Price's best. I think he is phenomenal in this movie. All of the performances are great. I have to stress though, my favorite thing about this movie is definitely the twist. The story is just so unbelievably strong. Again, it's another great horror movie for beginners. I first watched this movie, I think, when I was in 7th grade, so I was 12 years old, and it scared the ever-loving crap out of me. I had a Halloween party with a bunch of my friends, and we were all screaming, and watching it again now, it's just so funny because of how poorly it's held up, but it's also just a really fun time. I think it's a great one to throw on for a Halloween party because it's perfect for, you know, horror fans of any experience. Even if someone's not a horror fan, they would probably enjoy the story to some extent. It's just great for all the spooky vibes. It's great for Halloween time. Moving on to number 2. Now, this was extremely difficult. My top 2 are kind of interchangeable, although I do feel good about the placement. I'm gonna stick with it. Coming in at number 2 would be Invasion of the Body Snatchers from 1956. In Santa Mira, California, Dr. Miles Bennell is baffled when all his patients come to him with the same complaint. Their loved ones seem to have been replaced by emotionless imposters. Despite others' dismissive denials, Dr. Bennell, his former girlfriend Becky, and his friend Jack soon discover that the patient's suspicions are true. An alien species of human duplicates grown from plant-like pods is taking over the small town. The psychological impact that this movie had on me at the ripe old age of 8. Wow. Wow. This movie, again, another great one for beginners because the horror elements are so subtle, but they are still so disturbing. I remember the first time when I watched this as a child, my grandpa attempted to show it to me and we had to turn it off because I got so scared just because of the concept alone. The fact that the people you love walking and talking around you could seem like themselves, but something is off and you just know it's not them. It was too much. It was too much for my little brain. But I've rewatched it several times. It is one of my absolute favorite horror movies of all time. In the 50s, you know, post-World War II, things were changing in society. There was this idea of the nuclear family and being the perfect wife, having the perfect family, having the white picket fence. They were clinging to this idea of being homogenous, having a very normal society because after the war, that's, I guess, what everybody wanted. But then after a time, of course, you have the people that are like, wait, this is very robotic and weird. So then eventually, you know, in the late 60s and the 70s, people started partying and dropping acid and things got a lot more fun. But in the 50s, I feel like life just became too homogenous. Things were very robotic. And I think that this movie captures that really well because it's kind of about these people that are turning into these emotionless creatures that are just existing. I think the movie presents this really great lesson that humans can get very drudged down by normalcy and attempting to fit in. Life is not fun that way. Life gets very boring. Life without emotion is pointless. And as we follow this man and his ex-girlfriend, we learn about the importance of love and emotion. Very emotionally impactful, very psychologically impactful. I just think this movie it's fantastic. And it 100% holds up to today because number 1, the acting is phenomenal. It's very believable. But number 2, the concept didn't demand too much in the way of visuals. Like I've said again and again, it is very psychological and that's what it relies on. So this hands down obviously had to make my top 2. Okay, my dear children, are you ready For my number one, I feel like a lot of you could probably guess. If you couldn't guess already, my number one favorite horror movie from the 1950s goes to House of Wax from 1953. Wax sculptor Henry is horrified to learn that his business partner Matthew plans on torching their wax museum to collect the insurance policy. Henry miraculously survives a fiery confrontation with Matthew and reemerges some years hence with a museum of his own. But when the appearance of Henry's new wax sculptures occurs at the same time that a number of corpses vanish from the city morgue, art student Sue Allen begins suspecting wrongdoing. This movie is so good. So good. It's so good. 100% holds up to today's standards, especially with the practical effects. And the actual artistry of the wax figures used in this movie, oh, mwah, I revel in it every time. This movie is so rewatchable to me, and obviously it stars Vincent Price. I'm of the opinion that this is his best performance of all time. It's so genuinely frightening. The cinematography is so beautiful. Also conceptually just horrifying, so it works on all levels. On physical, you have the practical effects that look stunning. On a mental level, it is psychologically terrifying. And on an emotional level, this movie rips you apart because you really do care for all the characters and all of their relationships. And again, I think that one of the reasons why this movie holds up, not only because the wax work is just genuinely fantastic, but it's also because it was able to kind of rely on the more psychological aspects of the movie. So they really didn't overdo it in terms of all the horror elements. It was very strong in story as well. Now, I haven't decided yet, but I think that I might do a full dedicated review and breakdown of House of Wax, but I'm also kind of torn because I want to do one for Invasion of the Body Snatchers too, because I know that a lot of people just aren't going to watch movies from the 1950s. That's just kind of a sad fact, but like, it is what it is. A lot of us don't watch movies that came out before we were born, but I think this is such an overlooked decade of horror. I do think that a lot of these movies genuinely do hold up, and they are so entertaining. And so I hope that by making this video, I have maybe expanded your palette a little bit, and maybe you'll be more willing to check some of these movies out. If nothing else, just please check out my top 5. I know that's kind of a tall order, but my top 5 movies I believe are all ones that every horror fan needs to see. I mean, with The Thing, you can just get by just watching the remake, I'll give you that. But especially with House of Wax, Invasion of the Body Snatchers, and Creature from the Black Lagoon, those are all movies that you must watch in this lifetime. Don't deprive yourself. But let me know what you'd like to see, if you'd like to see a dedicated review of any of these movies, or if you'd like some other kind of topical 1950s related video. I'm not sure quite yet whether I'm going to be doing all of my top 10 videos in a row. Also, please let me know your top 10 horror movies from the 1950s, or even just like your top 3. I'd also love to get some more recommendations because this is one of my favorite decades of horror. There are bound to be a couple more diamonds in the rough that I missed, so please let me know. Also, let me know any recommendations that you have for movies from the 60s, 70s, 80s. I'm kind of cultivating my watch list right now to do the rest of the videos in this series, so any help would be much appreciated. Also, please do rate this look down below. Let me know how I did. I feel like I did a pretty good job, honestly, although we have to thank Cassie. Let's say it on 3, okay? 1, 2, 3. Thank you, Cassie. She's the one that took an hour this morning to actually do my hair. She blow dried it, she curled it, she did the whole works. So thank you, Mother. You are a true boss babe. All of that being said, definitely follow me on social media. I do post some behind the scenes kind of stuff for these videos, especially on my horror Instagram, like this video right here. Just to get you guys in the mood. Hope that you enjoyed, hope that you check out some of my other videos, hope you're super psyched for the rest of my decades of horror videos. Have a good day, and goodbye.